Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second event of the 2024-25 Jepson Leadership Forum, E Pluribus Unum, the Divisions Testing American Democracy. My name is Boyan Park, and I'm an assistant professor of leadership studies and sociology here at the University of Richmond. And I'd like to thank those of you who are joining us here on a rainy day via live stream for the presentation, Bridging Divides with Generative AI by Dr. Chris Bale. It is a great honor and true pleasure to welcome Chris at Richmond today. And the Dean of the Jepson School sent her regards because she's not able to attend. She's currently in Chile as a Fulbright specialist. This year, we invite scholars and experts to discuss how division and polarization affect American democracy. We will explore how and why divisions have manifested historically and currently in the United States, focusing on their impact on justice, education, politics, culture, technology, and class. We want to know whether divisions and the struggle to find common ground making us stronger or tearing us apart. As it is our custom, we asked a leadership studies student to both interview our forum speakers and introduce them at our events. Earlier today, Kate Chasen conducted a Take 5 interview, which will be posted online in the upcoming week, so keep an eye out for that. Kate is a junior from San Diego, California, double majoring in leadership studies and PPL, short for politics, philosophy, economics, and law, with a concentration in politics. On campus, she's a McDowell Fellow, a member of the Present Student Advisory Board, our tour guide, and competes on the mock trial and speech and debate teams. Post-graduation, Kate intends to pursue a master's in public policy and attend law school. Please join me in welcoming Kate to the stage.
Thank you, Dr. Park, for that incredible introduction. I will say it is an honor and pleasure to be in 2 of your classes this week, or this semester, and I hope that you keep that in mind as you grade my papers upcoming. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Dr. Christopher Bale, who I had the pleasure of interviewing a couple hours ago. Dr. Bale is a professor of sociology, political science, and public policy at Duke University and the founding director of Duke's Polarization Lab. A leader in the emerging field of computational social science, his research examines fundamental questions of social psychology using social media data, bots, and the latest advances in machine learning. He is the author of Breaking the Social Media Prism: How to Make Our Platforms Less Polarizing, available in the lobby. Published in 2021, this path-breaking book draws on innovative online experiments and in-depth interviews with social media users from across the political spectrum to explain why stepping outside of our echo chambers can make us more polarized, not less. Dr. Bale is the recipient of Guggenheim and Carnegie Fellowships, and he has also written for the New York Times and the Washington Post, and he has appeared on NBC Nightly News, CBS, CNN, and the BBC, just to name a few. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Bale to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Dr. Park, and thank you to Kate for that lovely introduction. I'm happy to be the opening act for the Mike Waltz and J.D. Vance show in an hour here. And though I can't promise that generative AI will bridge that divide, but I want to start on a bit of a dark note. And this is a conversation I had with a social media user about 3 years ago. This is a woman I'll call Sarah Rendon. And she's just told me about an experience she had on social media. And I said, tell me something about the last time you were on social media. And she said, well, I haven't been on social media in a while. And I said, well, why is that? And she said, well, 2 weeks ago, I was up late at night. I was scrolling through Twitter, one of the larger social media platforms out there. And as a daughter of a New York police officer, and a Puerto Rican mother, she has relatively conservative views on gun violence. But she went to a great liberal arts school, just like University of Richmond, She reads the New York Times. She has deep appreciation for many of the complicated issues that divide the left and the right on issues of guns. And yet you'll never hear about them if you follow her on social media. And here's why. This same night, she was asking a friend about something mundane, right, about her kids or about TV. And she was scrolling through Twitter and came across a post by the National Rifle Association. In the landscape of America's debate about guns, this was a relatively anodyne tweet. It said something like, "It's every American's right to own a gun." But she says within minutes, as so often happens on social media, that lots of people who disagree with that statement had started piling on and criticizing it, right? We've all seen this. And so she, seeing an absence of sort of moderate conservative views represented in this conversation, just simply posts, I agree. My husband owns a gun. He's a responsible gun owner, and it's every American's right to own a gun. Within 2 minutes, she had 2 replies, one of which said, "I hope your kids find your gun and shoot you." People had doxed her, meaning going and did research on her, discovered she had children, and made the connection that she was an irresponsible gun owner deserving of this kind of treatment, right? Now, I would love to tell you that Sarah is an outlier. But unfortunately, according to the Pew Research Center, one of our best polling organizations in the country, bipartisan group, the number one reason people are harassed online is for sharing their political views, as you can see here in this chart. So people with balanced or moderate views, we don't see them often, right? In fact, if you go on to social media, you're probably overwhelmed by extreme views. Most people report this. But with the tools of data science and machine learning, we can do a large-scale analysis and figure out, who are these people? Are they representative of the masses? And what we find is people who talk a lot about politics make up just about 6% of Twitter users. That's one platform, but an important one. But they create 73% of tweets about politics. So this tiny slice of people is creating the lion's share of information about politics on Twitter. But who are they? 55% of that 6% of people identify as very liberal or very conservative. But if we pull back and look at the entire population, we see that they're about 6% of the population. So what does that mean? It means if you wander out of your echo chamber for a day and you go looking for reasonable political debate about a controversial topic like gun violence, you are unlikely to encounter Sarah Rendon, the woman I was just profiling. You are likely to encounter one of the most extreme people in the United States. So this insight is what led us to found the Duke Polarization Lab. So we are a team of computer scientists, social scientists, statisticians, who are trying to both diagnose the key drivers of incivility online, but also, and maybe more importantly, develop solutions to push back. So we build apps and bots and other kinds of technology that people can use in tandem with social media sites in order to implement insights from our research, but also in order to see social media for what it is, a collection of extremists, for the most part. I'm not saying there aren't moderates out there. I'm only saying that due to the mechanics of social media, the way our news feed algorithms, the way content is ordered, we tend to see extremists on an issue like gun violence. I don't need to say much about America's gun violence debate because we hear about it all the time. We're in the age of presidential assassination attempts, school shootings, we have a mental health crisis. One could argue, I think convincingly, that this is one of the most controversial and one of the most important topics that divides Americans. We have long-standing and difficult to resolve debates about assault weapons, about arming teachers. And yet at the same time, a majority of Americans support universal background checks, a majority of Americans agree on a number of different issues about gun violence. But again, if you enter into a conversation about guns on social media, my prediction is this will not be your experience. Politics, maybe it's supposed to happen at the dinner table, right? I'd ask you to think about Thanksgiving dinner, but I know Thanksgiving dinner can get a little politicized. In fact, when some economists took these things we all carry in our pockets all the time and tracked the number of minutes that people spend at Thanksgiving dinner, they discovered about 4 years ago that Thanksgiving dinners are quite a bit shorter when a phone comes from a liberal zip code and a conservative zip code. So we really know that even at Thanksgiving dinner, the once sacrosanct, crucible of American politics, we're not seeing the productive compromise that we might like to. And this is a concern that motivates a lot of, in my opinion, really wonderful organizations. Groups like Braver Angels, Bridge Alliance, the Burke Paine Society, Living Room Conversations. These groups try to bring Americans together around a dinner table to talk about a divisive issue like gun control, immigration, climate change. And they provide skilled facilitators who are trained in conflict mediation in order to teach people how to have better debates. Now, everybody doesn't always leave happy. In fact, people who participate in these kind of conversations describe them as being very difficult. We're not going to agree after one dinner. But the value proposition of these organizations is that if one dinner can seed 5 more dinners, and that dinner can seed 10 more dinners, maybe, just maybe, we can begin to break away at the polarization that's sort of, in many people's views, crippling our country. There's a few problems, though. Number one, how many of you have been to one of these dinners? 0. One person. How many of you know a facilitator of one of these organizations? 1 or 2. It takes years to develop the expertise in conflict mediation to do this. And as our brief survey just showed, people don't like doing this. People don't like going to dinner with people who they disagree with. Let's face it, we're pretty divided about a lot of issues like gun control. And so even if we could pump all of Elon Musk's wealth into these organizations, which I don't think he's planning on doing, we wouldn't move the needle. Not only because it's hard to get people to go, and it's hard to train people, and it's hard to get people to stay, and it's hard to get people to listen to each other, but because our political dialogue has shifted away from the dinner table and to social media, like it or not. A lot of people who do this kind of research would tell you social media is the problem, and that all we need to do is go back to bowling together or eating dinner together, right, or whatever else it is you do for fun, right? And that's a beautiful idea. I'm old enough to remember a time before social media, and looking at some of the gray hair in the audience, I suspect some of you were youngins back then too, right? And it's easy to look at young people today, like so many of the students here, and say, you just don't know. You just don't know the power of human connection. But guess what? If I ask any of the students here whether they're planning on stopping to use social media, or whether their friends are going to stop using social media, or whether they think in 5 or 10 years social media will not exist, I'd get a pretty crazy look. Am I right, students? Social media is here to stay. And so if we want to solve these problems, which are increasingly moving online, we have all sorts of data to back this up. It's not just that people don't go to dinner together. It's not just that Thanksgiving dinners are shorter. It's also that we are more segregated from each other, politically speaking, than ever before. We're sorting into red and blue zip codes. So to the older folks in the room, and I'll put myself in that category, where are we going to have these conversations, right? There aren't bowling alleys anymore where there aren't bar stools where these conversations are happening. I wish there were, but there aren't. So if we have to be on social media, how can we make social media more productive? Over the last 10 years, a lot has changed. But one of the more exciting developments, I think many people would agree, is the rise of generative AI. So generative AI is a suite of technologies that grew out of large internet data sets. Right? We can scrape the entire internet, billions and billions of pieces of information. And using new advances in machine learning and neural network technology, we can begin to predict what text will follow given a certain chunk of text. So if I say, what is the best university in the Richmond area, right? Obviously, it's going to say University of Richmond, right? I mean, it's a no-brainer, right? But it can do so much more, right? And we're learning each day how it works. We're testing its capabilities each day. And so in the Duke Polarization Lab, we began to ask, could this be useful for bridging America's polarization problem? And at first, a bunch of people told us we're crazy, and sometimes I still think we're crazy. But we came up with an experiment. This was several months before ChatGPT came out. So if you remember ChatGPT, this was the sort of viral app that OpenAI created, which suddenly allowed you to talk to an AI, and people were having lots of fun with it in so many different places. We had tested early versions of it and seen that it was particularly good at one thing, and that's learning a different style of expression. So we've all seen this now, right? You take a Picasso painting and you turn it into a Van Gogh, right? Or you take a James Joyce novel, you rewrite it in the style of Toni Morrison or something like that, right? And it's really good at this because it's all just math over words, right? And if you know enough math and enough geometry of how words are co-used in different sentences, you can begin to do this in a convincing manner. What we realized is that AI might be really useful for helping us identify and learn to correct our own blind spots. So one sort of universal truth, one axiomatic property of social science, I would argue, is that people think they are great at arguing, but people are terrible at arguing. Just terrible. And we've done all sorts of clever studies about this, right? We can ask people, write a message that will convince someone to think differently about gun control, right? And people, I read this Wall Street Journal piece and I read this New York Times piece and this is really going to get them, And then we send it to the other side and they're like, nope, not this, right? Why does this happen? As social psychologists and psychology has taught us, we know that the moment we feel like we're trying to be persuaded, we throw up all sorts of cognitive defenses. It's our natural instinct, right? We don't like to lose autonomy. We don't like to feel like we're influenced. We like to feel in control. But this blinds us to perspective taking, being able to see the world through the eyes of someone else. I lied a little bit earlier when I said, we're not good at it. There are a small group of people called deep canvassers who randomized controlled trials by some of the best political scientists in the world, we think are sort of unicorns. These are people, for example, canvassing for deeply divisive issues like transgender rights in a deep red part of Florida. And you might think these people have no shot at changing anybody's mind. But in a large randomized controlled trial where canvassers, people who are going out to try to change someone's mind about an issue, we're taught about deep canvassing, which is learning to take the perspective of the person you're trying to convince, not right away, but ask them a few questions. Tell me which issues are important to you. What do you care about? What do you worry about for your kids, right? Starting to see the world through their eyes. This creates a rapport, right? It creates trust. It helps you understand what people think are important as you think about how to get your message across. And yet, how many of you in the heat of argument, especially on social media, lose sight of this? I do, and I study this stuff. I should know better, right? So I thought, maybe GPT-3, and now GPT-4, and the many other large language models, the class of generative AI that so many of us are excited about, could help. So let me take you through this experiment. We're going to get in the weeds a little bit here. So bear with me, but we're going to come back out after getting deep into a study and look at what happened when we tried this same study on a large social media platform where hundreds of millions of people benefited. So here we have on the left a typical conversation about gun control. So a more left-leaning person, says something like, guns are a stain on democracy. And someone more on the right says, guns help us protect democracy. And then in a typical social media conversation, that same liberal might say something like, you are incredibly naive, and launch into an attack, right? So we designed an online forum where we recruited thousands of Americans who had different views on gun control. And we put them into a chat. We just said, share your views about gun control. You're going to talk to someone else, and we measured all sorts of things about them before this. And in the control condition, they just had a chat. They just talked about gun control. But in the study's experimental condition, we took that message, you are incredibly naive, and instead of sending it to the person with whom the person was partnered to talk about gun control, we sent it to GPT-3. And we said, please, we always say please. I don't know why. Why do we do that? It's weird. It's a robot, right? Please rephrase this message to evince evidence-based strategy identified by social scientists, one of three types, and I'll tell you the three in just a minute, and show these to the person who's about to send this message. So the person, the left-leaning person who's about to say you are incredibly naive, instead they get a pop-up. And the pop-up says, you could try rephrasing your message in 3 different ways. Sometimes we use a strategy that conflict mediators use called active listening. So here, what we do is we train people to rehearse someone else's argument back to them to demonstrate that they have heard them. I think some of the married couples in the room know what I'm talking about here, right? Yeah? Okay, sorry. For the students, you'll get there soon enough. But no, it works, right? For those of you who are married, right? Like it's an important thing because we can talk past each other if we don't do this, right? Simple intervention. And so instead of saying, you are incredibly naive, you might start by saying, I understand that you value guns, right? You're validating, even if you don't agree with it. And by the way, our goal in this intervention was not to create an influence machine. That could be dangerous. Imagine this in the hands of Russia or any of our other adversaries, right? It could be a very dangerous tool. We also wanted to preserve human autonomy. We didn't just change their message. We said, here's another way of saying your message. And then we said, you can send this new message that we think is better. You can ignore it completely and send your original message, or you can rewrite your original message. So if people didn't like the AI, they didn't have to do anything with it. And the person they're talking to, by the way, doesn't know that the one person is being assisted by AI. Everybody knew they might encounter AI in the context of study, but they don't know who has AI assisting them. So in this case, this liberal chooses that message at the top. I understand that you value guns. That happened about 80% of the time. Most people chose one of the rephrased messages. And then the hope is that instead of devolving into the kind of, all too familiar conflict that we see on social media, maybe, just maybe, they would have a more productive conversation. So we launched this study with 1,800 people over a few weeks. And we hoped it would do 3 things. We hoped it would improve the quality of the conversation. What do we mean by quality of the conversation? Was it stressful? Did you feel heard? Did you feel like the person you were talking to understood your views? Just a general kind of measure of how did this conversation go. Second, a little bit of political science jargon for you, democratic reciprocity. How much do you want to have more conversations like this? Because coming back to that dining room table, right, a big part of the problem is that people don't want to have these conversations. Interestingly, we know that if people have these conversations offline at dinner tables, they very quickly want to have more. They realize how different people are in person compared to on social media. And so we hoped that this intervention could also make people want to have more of these types of conversations. Finally, we measured what they actually thought about guns. We asked them what they thought about Army students. We asked them what they thought about assault weapon bans. We asked them what they thought about mental health and guns. Now, we did this even though we were hoping that our intervention wouldn't actually change someone's mind. We only wanted to change the way people spoke to each other and not whether they could influence each other. That was important to us because that's the human element here, right? People are entitled to their views. And the idea that AI could, at great scale, say during a presidential election, change lots of people's minds is pretty terrifying to me. So we didn't want to change what they were saying. If they were pro-gun, we wanted them to voice their pro-gun message, but in a way that would be more receptive, we thought, to someone who doesn't share their views. So in social science these days, we can pre-register our hypotheses. That means we go online and we say, here's what we think is going to happen before we run the experiment. And that prevents us from massaging the findings and sort of willfully analyzing the data. And what we found is that GPT-3 was used for most every discussion, whether people were talking about mental health or background checks or personal experiences with gun violence. These graphs are a little hard to read, so I'll sum it up for you. If your partner was being assisted by ChatGPT, and if they used it a lot, the more they used it, the more you rated the conversation as less stressful, more productive, the more you reported feeling heard. Turning to democratic reciprocity on the right here, the more your partner, only one person in these experiments was being assisted by ChatGPT, the more that your partner used ChatGPT, used those rephrased messages that were designed to use evidence-based research on conflict mediation to show people and train them how to rephrase their messages in a more productive way. If your partner, your discussion partner was being assisted by that, you reported wanting more conversations with people who you disagree with. So people had better conversations and they wanted more conversations across party lines or across issue lines. What about their actual attitudes about guns? Fortunately, we didn't find that this tool is a persuasion machine, or at least not quite. It's an interesting anecdote in these data, which again are hard to read, so I'll walk you through it. If I'm being assisted by AI, and let's say Kate isn't, you might think that I should be changing Kate's mind, right? Because I have this fancy tool that lets me recall all of human knowledge and do it in a way that is tailor-made to Kate's political views, right? Turns out, I changed my mind. AI helps me, we think, take the perspective of others, and in so doing, I convince myself instead of trying to convince someone else. Really odd artifact of the data, which has since been replicated by a few different teams at Cornell and MIT. Okay, but let's come back. A big but here. This is all well and good, but this was one experiment at one point in time in one country for one issue before anyone in the public even knew what ChatGPT was, because this was 2 months before ChatGPT was publicly released again. And more fundamentally, coming back to Sarah Rendon, the woman who I mentioned at the outset, the moderate Republican with nuanced views about race and policing that many of us think should be more prominent on social media, how's this going to help her? You know, in academia, too often we do the research, and then we're sort of like, here you go, you know, Jepson leadership, you guys got this, right? You guys do the translational part, we just do the research. But that's a cop-out, right? And that's why I think institutes like yours are so valuable, right? We learn that, you know, science doesn't communicate itself, right? And we need to go out and be proactive and see whether these things can actually create meaningful change in the world. And so about 2 months after we had published the paper, we were approached by Nextdoor. So how many people use Nextdoor? A lot of people. Mostly the older folks. For the younger folks, this is for homeowners. This is where you know, if a party gets out of control, you call the cops, or you know, or whatever. You know, it's Seriously though, next door you might think, this should be one of the good ones, right? These are your neighbors. For Pete's sake, you should be able to have a productive conversation with your neighbors, right? Wrong. Nationally representative survey out of USC reports that Nextdoor is the most toxic platform in the country, right? Our neighbor, it's funny, not funny, right? You guys, it says this is, I don't know. I can report from my own neighborhood. This has some face validity. But so Nextdoor comes to us with this significant problem, right? We have neighbors yelling at each other. This was coming out of COVID, right? We had debates about masking, we had debates about Black Lives Matter, all sorts of other debates, right? And so might the tools that you developed be useful in mitigating some of the tension that we're seeing on Nextdoor? And so here's what we did. So you can't read this, so I'll read it for you. This is a real interaction between two users on Nextdoor. Vanessa here at the top has announced Mick Jagger, her dog, how adorable is that? Mick Jagger has been found. Thanks for all your help locating him, right? And in my neighborhood, this would be cause for celebration, right? We found the dog, everybody's looking for him, great, right? But this gentleman, and it is a gentleman, writes, quote, "The owner is a horrible person who shouldn't be able to own a dog if they can't get a hold of it. They should be reported and arrested for animal abuse." Nextdoor, ladies and gentlemen. So what can you do? Well, and to their credit, I'm being a little facetious because I do admire not many tech firms are willing to try these kinds of things, right? It's risky. It could have gotten worse. The AI could have gone rogue. There was a lot of risk here, but perhaps it shows us where we're at as a society, where we're looking for these solutions so quickly. Nextdoor came up with this really interesting idea. When someone's about to send that nasty message, not all the time, just one for every 100,000 posts, give or take, they see this message: kind replies make a difference. And then, just like in our study, they see multiple ways to rephrase their message. So here's what Mr. Williams ultimately chose to share. "It's concerning to see a dog wandering around without its owner in sight. It's important for pet owners to be responsible and keep their pets safe. If you're unable to locate your dog, it's important to take action and report it to authorities. Let's work together and ensure the safety and well-being of all the animals," right? So, preserving the message, right? He's still angry. He's still, he's still sort of communicating that he does not like that Mick Jagger was lost, right? But he has said this in, let's say, a bit more kind way. So this is a little different than our study for a few important reasons. One, this is rolled out all over Nextdoor. So these are hundreds of thousands of interactions. It's not something that's popping up every time you're mean to someone else. It's happening once for each person. And then it's happening for every kind of conversation. So not just gun control. Your dog gets lost, you left the trash out, right? You did or did not mask, whatever it was, right? Every kind of intervention. So it's not just going to be something about gun control. Third, it's happening all over the country, not just people who are willing to talk to strangers about politics. These are neighbors. And finally, and maybe most importantly, they are intervening on already toxic conversations. So in our study, we just said, have a conversation. And some of these started out quite pleasantly, But these people are about to have it out, right? And so you could argue it's a much higher bar for the AI to pass. Can you de-escalate an already toxic conversation? Turns out, according to Nextdoor's transparency report, the kindness intervention reduced the creation of toxic content by 15%. That's huge in social science terms. We're lucky if we move the needle 0.000001% a lot of the time. 15% is a large effect. And let's translate this to these communities, right? If we're intervening on the order of hundreds of thousands of people, and 15% of hundreds of thousands of people, that's a lot of people. And more importantly, maybe this has a multiplier effect. Maybe one person being a little kinder begets kindness. And Julia Minson, a wonderful social psychologist at Harvard, has done a series of experiments that show civility is contagious. We know toxicity is contagious, right? Look all over social media, it's everywhere. But civility can also be contagious. So how could we capture this? Well, it's really exciting that so many people in the AI world are working on this problem. So earlier this year, I met these guys who created Temper, which is a tool that a nonprofit can use to implement these types of insights in their research. They can intervene on a polarized conversation and try to bring people together, or dispatch the tool to those same people to try to turn down the temperature. And we hope that if more people use AI, we're having this conversation, is AI good, is AI bad? And I'll bet a lot of you came into this conversation with a pretty strong view one way or the other. Most people have a really strong view, right? Either it's the greatest thing that ever happened, or it's Terminator and it's going to destroy us, right? Okay, Terminator's scary, but you get the point, right? The point is, the truth is probably somewhere in between. And if we want to take the best kind of advantage of these tools, we need to take some risks, measured risks, but we need to recognize that with the bad, and I could have talked all night about the threat of misinformation and deepfakes, and especially now that these things are conversational at scale. Imagine what's going on in the Russian Internet Research Agency right now, where they are deploying open source large language models in order to sway voters in rural North Carolina or wherever, right? We need to also go on the offensive. We can't only play defense. It's like preventative health. You don't just wait for everybody to get sick, right? We can do things to get ahead of it. And that's why I'm so excited about this research, and really eager to hear what you all have to say and answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this really thought-provoking talk. We're going to take questions from the room now. So what we're going to ask is to raise your hand, and then we're going to have folks coming at you with mics. Yes, why don't we?
Hi. So admittedly, I actually don't know how old the origin of your research is, so you may not have time to do this yet. But you mentioned earlier on in your lecture that people are just bad at arguing.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you guys have either looked at this or had enough time to look at this, or have any plans in the future to look at whether or not the more people use these tools, if the I don't want to use the word correction, but the intervention becomes less necessary over time. Does it actually change behavior in the way people argue? Do they become more civil over time to where the intervention isn't as necessary?
I think you're asking a great question, because if you think about launching this even bigger, right, going out to Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or wherever, you could imagine some unintended consequences, right? I mean, for one, can you imagine if every time you're about to post something, this little paperclip comes up and says, hey, you might want to try it like this, right? No, that's a hard no for me, right? So there is probably a sweet spot, right? In other words, we wouldn't want to intervene on every post. We don't yet know where that sweet spot is, right? I think that's going to take a lot more research. But one thing, earlier I was trying to convince you that social media is not going away. AI is not going away, right? Just 2 days ago, Mark Zuckerberg at Meta's developer conference, which if you don't speak computer nerd is sort of the Super Bowl, he just announced that AI is coming to your newsfeed, right? So instead of your friends talking about politics, that's already happening, right? Tailored messages to you by an AI, right? So we know so little about what's going to happen, right? If you were worried about withdrawing from human conversation earlier, maybe you're much more worried with this, right? But maybe a little dose of, self-reflection could go a long way. But I think the answer to your question, to be perfectly honest, is we just don't know yet.
Right. Anybody else?
Hi. So Nextdoor agreed to use this tool. Is there any other platforms that are interested in using that tool, the Generative AI tool?
I hope so. We haven't personally been approached. We did a collaboration with Judy Woodruff, who, if anybody know Judy Woodruff, the older folks know, again, the younger people don't. I'm dating myself tonight, jeez. Okay, Judy Woodruff, American treasure of a journalist, is doing a really brilliant PBS series called Crossroads. And she's sort of going out into every town in America and trying to sort through these kinds of issues. And so they came and visited us, and we did a demo and put out this tool using text. So you don't even have to be on a social media site. You can just text with someone who disagrees with you, and you can have that conversation wherever you are. And we think that this might also facilitate greater adoption outside the US. So some of the places approaching us are peace-building communities in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where internet is not guaranteed. So we think and hope it's possible. But again, we want to take baby steps. We tried gun violence in the US, but maybe religious violence in Somalia is a bridge too far, right? Those are the questions we still don't know. So I think in general, these platforms are risk averse. It's going well in terms of the stock value. So shaking it up is a difficult proposition. Now, if you're an optimist, you could say we're early in the story of social media. It's only been around, really, depending on how you define it, 10, 20 years. And so you might say, people freaked out when the printing press came out. Like, people freaked out when the car came out. I wasn't alive then, students. But you know what I mean? Like, so there's a bit of a moral panic that always, is sort of inevitably emerges here. But, hopefully we'll reach some kind of plateau of productivity where we figure out what AI is good at, what it's bad at, and how we can plug it into systems that are just screaming for it. And I think social media is one of them. Yeah.
Have you done any kind of correlation between the more caustic remarks that come out on these social media platforms and whether that's related to people that have dark tetrad personality types?
Yeah.
And I'm curious what you found, because that's like, 3% of the population, and you said the extremes are 6?
Yep.
It could be quite a high domination, especially with the most vitriolic comments.
Absolutely. First, I'll tell you a story, and then I'll give you some data on this. And the story is from the 4th chapter of my book. And it's about a guy who I call Ray in the book. It's not his real name, trying to protect his identity. And we did 2 things in the research for this book. We did interviews with people, so we talked to people, asked them all sorts of questions about social media. And then we also followed them online. So we pull with the tools of data science, all however many tweets or posts people make, we look at all those and we talk to them. And so with Ray, nicest guy you'll ever meet. I mean, just like effusively happy, friendly, goes out of his way to say, oh, I never talk about politics or religion. I'm just about making friends with people. Just wonderful guy. And I leave this interview being like, maybe there's hope for this guy. Just really great. Then we open up his Twitter feed. And it is the most reprehensible stuff I've seen in 12 years of studying this stuff. Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde every single night. Up till 2 in the morning, and we can do with digital forensics. We can see he's posting at 2 a.m. a photoshopped picture of Michelle Obama in ways that I can't describe on the stage, right? I mean, just terrible stuff. And so the question is, what motivates someone like Ray? Because you're right to put the numbers on it, right? This 6% of the population of Twitter users is generating 76% of the content, and they have the most extreme views in the country, right? So what motivates them to do that? And we like to think of social media as a competition of ideas. And in the early days of social media, that was supposed to be the idea, right? It was supposed to be an open forum, free debate. Minority voices could be empowered, no more gatekeepers, right? But I think we can all agree now that was a little naive, right? I don't think like Jean-Jacques Rousseau is going to do case study if we could reincarnate him from the dead, right, on Twitter, right? Instead, we need to think about social media as a competition for status, right? What do we all want as humans? What distinguishes us from other creatures? It's our desire to have other people like us, you know? And this is baked into us. You know, if we social psychologists in the room can tell you this goes back to the 1930s at least, if not a lot further. We know, you know, we've been studying this for a long time. And so if you think about it, what does social media do to a person like Ray? I'll tell you a little bit more about him. He's a 55-year-old man. He's not married. He lives with his mother. He's a Republican man who lives in a liberal city and works in a liberal job. And so when you think about it, he's got no escape valve, right? And so every night, everything he wanted to say at the water cooler just comes flooding out, right? And even worse, you know, you can think of social media like sonar. You know, you're throwing stuff out there and seeing what comes back, right? And what people don't realize is the stuff that comes back, the likes, the follows, all the positive engagement, that's not a random sample of the population saying, hey, Ray, we like your Photoshop memes, right? That is the rest of that 6% of extremists saying, yeah, great job, right? Giving Ray the false impression that he is in fact in the majority, yeah? And so that's why I call this book Breaking the Social Media Prism, because I think what social media does is it refracts reality back to us. And so we need ways to both reveal that funhouse mirror, but we also need ways to change the incentive structure, to fundamentally change why people use social media. And we have some ideas about that I could share if folks are interested. Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm asking this correctly, but the reason people get vitriolic on social media is because they're semi-anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll put myself in the old crowd here. You know, we talk to people in person and on the phone,
Yeah.
and you couldn't be anonymous. So you
Yeah.
wouldn't say the kinds of things that are said on
Right.
social media. And so I'm wondering for the really young, like the elementary school kids now,
Yeah.
if they're going to live their life on social media, are they going to ever learn how to have a civil conversation with
Yeah.
somebody if they have all their conversations online instead of in person, or,
Right.
you know?
So I'm nodding my head because I was 100% in agreement with you until we ran a study to test this. So one of the hard things about social media research, and to the earlier question about how can we get social media companies to do this, we often can't get them to change things. We often can't get the data. And then even when we do get the data, there's all sorts of headaches. So what can you do? You can make your own social media platform and do research on it, which is what we did in our lab. And one of the reasons why we wanted to do that is we wanted to try exactly what you're talking about. My good friend John Haidt, you know, very famously argues that the problem with social media is just like you say. If people say things online they would never say in person because there's no repercussions, right? There's no social sanctioning, right? And so we thought, okay, well, let's test this idea. Small little experiment. We'll have Republicans and Democrats talk to each other, but we will give them varying amount of information about each other. Because even though your view and my old view was that this was probably a net negative, someone else in, let's say, Egypt in the beginning of the so-called Arab Spring, the uprisings from about a decade ago, right, might say, actually, anonymity is really important, right, because it allows me to speak truth to power, or whatever you want to say, right? And so you have these two competing views, and I was very much on your side, yeah? And what did we find? Exactly the opposite. Anonymity actually led to more civil conversations, not less civil conversations, especially for Republicans. So the size of that effect was 4 to 6 times larger for Republicans. And we don't have a perfect way to interpret the results, to be honest. You know, sometimes in science you get an artifact of a finding like this and we want more studies. Of course, we're researchers, we always want more research. But my personal interpretation of this is that the cost of voicing your views to other Republicans for Republicans is so high if you don't agree with the majority that anonymity actually allows you to test and explore viewpoints that you're afraid of your side hearing, not the other side. And I would guess that many of the people who have been harassed for sharing their political views in this room were not harassed by the other side, but by their own side, almost as often. That's certainly something we're seeing in the data. So it's one study, we need more studies, but it seems like the story is complicated and that under certain circumstances, anonymity may allow people to explore unpopular opinions.
My question was, I was gonna ask the connection between, like, if you want to further a connection between AI like generating a response, but then also fact checking, because I was first thinking of like how when when Twitter got turned into X, and then they started adding like community checks at the bottom to regulate if the tweets were made in good faith or just if they were factually true.
Yeah.
And then I also thought of like Jubilee and like the middle ground, and then also like their surrounded aspect on their YouTube.
Yes.
And how when they do say something that isn't correct, they fact check it. Would you want to further a relationship between not only rephrasing a response, but allowing for fact checking to be provided in like spaces?
Yeah,
like that?
100%. It's such a great question, right? Fact checking is hard to do, right? We see that in our debates. Maybe we'll see that in 20 minutes or so, right? We're going to have a debate tomorrow about fact checking, right? What if AI can do it, right? It can go search the entire internet very quickly, the sum total of human knowledge, more or less, and try to figure out, if these rumors that one candidate is talking about are true or not. So the program that you mentioned, which I don't think many of you are Twitter users, but I'll just go out on a limb and say a lot of you aren't Twitter users. This program, which is called Community Notes, is a crowdsourced solution to the misinformation problem. So it's actually started by my former student, Mary Beth Phelan Hunziker, and she and others had the insight that it's impossible for any single platform to make these calls, right? Probably people have all sorts of different views about Hunter Biden's laptop, right? But we're still having that conversation somehow, right? Years later, right? But there's so many others, right? And so the question is sort of, what if we shift that burden away from the company and to the people who use the platform? So here you have this program where volunteers can go out onto Twitter, and if they see something that they think is misinformation or misleading, they can flag it. And they write a little note that says, I think this is misleading because X, or I think this is misinformation because Y. Now, I love this question for so many reasons. Like, and when my student told me about this program, I was like, this is so cool. Like, this is gonna work. It failed miserably. Not miserably, that's a little unfair. It didn't work, but here's why. If I'm a motivated Democrat, right, I basically go out and I start flagging everything conservatives are saying is misinformation, and hey, guess what? The conservatives are doing the same thing, right? So the actual labeling of misinformation becomes a political football, yeah? So in my book, I propose something called a bridging algorithm. So if you know a little bit about how social media works, we get these messages, and the order in which the messages appear is determined by how much other people engage with them. So, if I say something crazy, and you all reply to my message, say you're crazy, use every expletive you know about me, right? My message goes right to the top, right? And this is one of the big problems with social media. And so the idea of a bridging-based algorithm is that instead of surfacing the controversial stuff, let's surface the stuff that different types of people agree about. So if Republicans and Democrats both like a post, that should come earlier, not the divisive stuff. And I was saying, we academics don't go off into the real world enough and try to, and I thought this was a cool idea, but I was like, nobody's ever gonna go for this, right? It's kind of kumbaya, like nobody's really gonna try this. Twitter, about a year before Elon Musk acquired the platform, tried it. And when they tried the bridging algorithm, the sharing of information dropped 25 to 35%. Because they were able to boost the messages of people whose messages were marked as useful by both Republicans and Democrats. So now if you start to think about the scale of social media, it doesn't have to be Republican, Democrat. It could be male, female, Could be VCU, University of Richmond. You guys aren't even rivals, right? Is that right? I'm sorry, I'm new here. Could be any kind of social division, right? And then social media becomes a tool for avoiding fear of missing out. Another human instinct, right? We want to know what everybody else who's different than us is doing, right? That's one of our biggest human instincts and needs. So yeah, I don't know what's happening at X now, what the new name of Twitter for those of you who are uninitiated. But as far as I know, the program's still going on, but it still requires those moderate people, or maybe they're not even moderates, they're just fair, right? They're calling balls and strikes. It depends upon those people. And so big question is, will those people, maybe Sarah Rendon, those types, right? Will they be going on places like Twitter if it becomes increasingly toxic? And that's why I think it's such a big problem. But great question, thank you.
Great. So apparently we only have 1 minute left, so I'm going to ask you the question I've been dying to ask you, if I may. I study political strategists who run presidential campaigns. And what they've been asking me is, are we going to ever get an algorithm that's going to allow us to capture persuasion? Because they want to know if their actual strategies are actually working, right? What are your thoughts about how your work can relate to actually reaching that goal?
So this is just my view. It's sort of a good news, bad news thing. If you watch scary documentaries about social media, and if you read the media, you're probably under the impression that social media is like a hypodermic needle. And if Russia wants to inject opinions into us, it can do that. It's a super seductive idea, right? Because our feeble human brains are competing against the power of machine learning, right? Remember the Terminator over here, right? Like how can we possibly not be persuaded? What's really interesting is the few studies we have. We don't have enough studies, and I'm sure you know some of these. But when we study like Cambridge Analytica, and if you heard the media narrative about that, that created Brexit, that gave Trump the election. When we went back in carefully, especially a team of researchers at MIT, and also our lab, we found it had almost no effect. So the good news here is we have a narrative, right? We don't want that narrative to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Where we start to think that algorithms are actually all powerful, because for better or worse, persuasion is really hard. People don't change their minds very often. And so, AI will probably never be better than the best human communicator. And if the best human communicators are struggling, I predict AI will continue to struggle. So we'll see stories, and sometimes it'll work. But I hope that it won't be the hypodermic needle I just described to inject opinions into the masses. Yeah.
So very much.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you all.